All right, looks like we have a couple more folks that are joining right now. Well, as folks are getting tuned in, let me just share a couple of quick announcements for you this morning. Similar to other sessions you've probably joined, if you have any questions for our speakers today, go ahead and enter them in that chat or in the Q&A that's in the right of your Whova viewing window. We'll try to make sure that there's time for the conversations. We are recording this session and it will be available in Whova for you about 2 weeks after the conference or after the Congress ends. We ask you to keep your microphones and cameras off unless the presenters ask you to turn them on. And it looks like we're ready to get started. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Don to kick us off.
Great. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, or wherever you're at in the world. Just wanted to invite everybody in and welcome you to our second half of our session that we started this morning, Advances and Challenges for Indigenous Fire Stewardship, which is a session that is co-organized by Mary Huffman, Amy Cardinal Christensen, and Frank Lake, and myself. And we're going to start off the second half today with Skye Greenler's presentation on burning for people, wildlife, and landscapes, modeling cultural fire regimes in the California Klamath Mountains. And Skye is with the Oregon State University College of Forestry, and I'll turn it over to Skye. Thanks.
Thank you, guys. Let me get my screen shared here. All right, thank you.
That's great.
It's looking good. That's what I like to hear. Okay, find my mouse. Maybe. Sorry, guys. All right, so thanks all for tuning in to this session. Virtually, there's a lot of great people here. As Don said, my name's Skye Greenler, and I'm a fourth-year PhD student at Oregon State University in the College of Forestry. And I'm going to present results today from a large collaborative project to develop estimates of cultural fire regime characteristics across a really large landscape in Northern California to eventually be able to better integrate cultural burning into landscape scale fire modeling and management. And this work was really made possible by a large team of collaborators, some of whom are actually on the panel today, who bring really diverse knowledge and expertise to this project, including close collaborations with the Western Klamath Restoration Partnership and the Karuk tribe. And I do want to note that this project has been developed and conducted under a practicing PCAV research agreement with the Karuk tribe. And the results I present today and the process we've developed is really intentionally designed to protect, uplift, and center Indigenous knowledge, as well as protect culturally sensitive information and knowledge sovereignty. So there's pieces where I might present kind of only a partial picture of a map or partial information, and that's really intentional for that reason. We don't want to, there we go. So for millennia, people have lived on fire-prone landscapes across the globe and have really depended on cultural burning to steward the land, promote important resources, and develop landscape mosaics that can receive lightning ignitions, often without real concern. And the mosaics of vegetation, fuels, and habitats that developed underneath these Indigenous fire stewardship regimes often have abundant high-quality food, medicinal, and material resources, such as basketry materials, that are importantly consistently available across the landscape. They often have high-quality habitat for wildlife species, such as fresh browse and wintering habitat for ungulates, and reduce wildfire risk, especially around really critical locations on the landscape. And when considered holistically, what we start to see is that there's a tight and almost inextricable web of connections between these fire-prone ecosystems, fire-dependent species, and fire-dependent cultures. And Indigenous fire stewardship practices and beliefs, they vary substantially between tribes and regions, as kind of was talked about in that first session, but it's often grounded in this sense of stewardship responsibility or balance between humans and nature. And in this talk, I'm really going to focus primarily on the Karuk and neighboring tribes in Northern California and kind of those perspectives. In Western scientific and land management communities, there's really increasing recognition that Indigenous fire stewardship practices are a key component to landscape restoration and moving towards a future where we can live with fire in a more positive way. But it's important to note that this is kind of this new catchy buzz phrase in many circles, but tribes have known and asserted this for many decades. However, actually integrating burning into contemporary management frameworks has been a real challenge for several different reasons. But a major one is uncertainty around scaling up cultural burning from smaller projects to large areas over large timescales, especially across mixed jurisdictions and different land ownership. One of the ways that Western scientists often study this type of uncertainty is by using landscape scale computer models to simulate different scenarios. And essentially what these models do is develop a set of rules and that allow us to essentially burn a digital version of the landscape over hundreds of kind of computer years. And this allows us to ask what if questions about things that we wouldn't be able to otherwise see or measure because they occur over large areas and longer time periods. We can ask questions like, what would the landscape look like if we managed fire differently? Perhaps by not suppressing all of the ignitions that occur in the fall or spring when they're easier to manage, or if tribes were able to resume substantial cultural burning to steward the landscape. We can ask what this might be like under climate change, and we can also look backwards in time to ask what the landscape could have looked like 200 years ago. These models are pretty common, and they're used globally to help inform decision-making, but they almost never include cultural burning. And this really erases Indigenous fire stewardship practices by saying, oh, well, we think cultural ignitions are really just the same as lightning. But we know this isn't true in very many cases. And the lightning ignitions and cultural ignitions have some really substantial differences. One of which is that cultural burning often occurs on different parts of the landscape than where lightning is the most common. It often occurs at different times of the year, and it's often occurring more frequently than lightning ignitions. And all of these components together mean that cultural fire regimes have very different fire intensity and effects than fire regimes that were driven solely by lightning. So excluding them from the model is really not giving us a whole picture. On landscapes such as our study area in Northwestern California, we know cultural burning was an important part of the historical fire regime and needs to be a key part of looking forward to how we can live with fire in the future. Excluding cultural burning from this what if fire modeling is a huge omission. And the landscape you see delineated here is the area of the Western Klamath Restoration Partnership and includes much of the ancestral territory of the Karuk tribe, who are both the key partners on this work. And that blob in the lower left corner is our about 100,000 hectare kind of focal area where we're focusing today. When we map lightning ignitions on this landscape, we see that lightning tends to be the most abundant on the eastern side of this area, which is kind of a high elevation mountain range. However, we know that Karuk villages, which you see in this map from the Smithsonian, and their associated cultural burning practices were frequently along the river corridors. So there's kind of a spatial mismatch between where we know cultural burning was occurring and where we see a lot of lightning occurring today. And this just roughly demonstrates the differences between location in cultural ignitions and lightning ignitions, but it doesn't give us any information on important components of seasonality or frequency. And this brings us to the focal objective of our work, which is to map ignition estimates of cultural ignitions across our focal landscape to better understand the differences between cultural and lightning ignitions and allow us to integrate cultural ignitions into landscape scale modeling. There's two things that are really necessary to do this work, which I'm going to focus on today. And the first is breaking the landscape up into groups that have similar fire regime characteristics, cultural fire regime characteristics. And the second is assigning estimates of ignition seasonality and frequency to each group. And so broadly, we're developing this map to describe where cultural ignitions were occurring and how often they were occurring. The three major components that we're focusing on are ignition location, ignition seasonality, and ignition frequency. We approached this project from a real co-production standpoint, meaning we started off with an end goal that we all wanted to achieve, to being able to model cultural fire on the landscape, and have been collaboratively refining the questions, honing the methods, and thinking about the results. We started this work off with a comprehensive review of knowledge that already exists for the region. And this review incorporated a wide range of sources, from historical interviews and maps to more recent reports, theses, and scientific articles. And throughout the process, we've worked to really center Indigenous voices and knowledge as strong and valid pieces of evidence, rather than somewhat automatically giving increased weight to Western scientific studies, which is what's done kind of all too often. We then collaboratively synthesized all of the pieces, interpreted the different data sources using both contemporary knowledge of landscape processes and functions, as well as knowledge that's been passed down through generations. And this has been a very place-based process, often occurring at specific locations in the field or with different maps. It's also been very iterative, and we've kind of gone back to that knowledge review as we've been synthesizing things and different questions have come up, and then kind of come back to synthesize these. So through this process, we settled on the guiding question of, if cultural burning had been maintained on the landscape for the last 150 years, how would Karuk people use fire to steward the landscape today? And this framing acknowledges the fact that knowledge is not stationary and shifts with time and circumstance. So there's no real way to know with absolute certainty what occurred historically, but by blending all of our sources, we can come up with an estimate we feel pretty good about. As we work through this process, it's become clear that's what's needed for this project is not generating new knowledge per se, but really working together to collaboratively synthesize and make meaning of hundreds of pages of existing interviews, reports, and previous studies. I'm now going to transition into specifics of how we're working to develop estimates of cultural ignition location, seasonality, and frequency. So the first piece we tackled was mapping out the locations on the landscape with similar cultural burning characteristics. And we're calling these cultural fire regime groups for right now. What we've started with was a coarse map of vegetation from land fire, which is a national product that you see here. And then we worked to split and refine groups, primarily by thinking through the interactions between landscape biophysical conditions like slope and aspect, with where we knew specific key cultural use species were found and stewarded on the landscape. And this resulted in a map with 8 different cultural fire regime groups, which you see here. The next step was to hone our estimates of where cultural fire ignitions were occurring on the landscape and think about where people were most likely to be conducting cultural burns. In our landscape, it's quite clear that Indigenous fire stewardship was most common in the 2 to 3 miles around villages, which is the area you see highlighted on the map. This comes up often in interviews with tribal elders who say things like, "My father always said they burned all the time around the village sites. It was mostly just oak trees and no brush, so you could see half a mile under the trees." Similarly, we know that there was a lot of burning that occurred along trail networks and traversable ridges that connected villages to important places in the higher country. So today, we've also pulled out these corridors across the landscape, and this gives us a map of areas where cultural burning likely had the strongest influence and areas where the influence was potentially not quite as strong. Next, we assign burn seasonalities to each of our cultural fire regime groups to describe when in the year cultural burning was occurring at different areas on the landscape. After our literature review and collaborative synthesis, we came up with 4 main factors to consider, and I've mapped those onto a circular calendar here. The first is fuel receptivity, or when the fuel at a site can actually carry a fire. And this is an important influence in much of the year except the hottest summer months. An example of this is when open grassy sites may be able to carry a fire versus when kind of oak or tan oak litter that's denser and moister might be able to carry a fire. And the second factor relates to how people live on and move through the landscape, because cultural burning in specific parts of the landscape is going to be much more common when people were actually in and using those parts of the landscape. So on our landscape, one example is that in the late fall and, or I guess in the early fall and late summer, people would head up into the high country to hunt and gather, and often light fires on their way back down along trails and ridges as they were coming down to the river. There's also spiritual and cultural factors that are important at specific times of the year. So for instance, very little burning outside of kind of cooking and heating fires is done in the spring due to beliefs surrounding how fire affects nesting birds and other animals that are reproducing. Finally, throughout the entire year, the timing of burning is tied to specific resource characteristics of specific plants. For instance, tan oak stands are often burned in the fall after the buggy acorns fall, but before the good acorns fall, and this both reduces the pests and also makes a really good surface for gathering acorns. And the last important characteristic is frequency, or how often the site is burned. This is again based on fuel receptivity, because a site can only carry a fire after it's accumulated enough fuel to actually burn. But it's also based on how plants grow after a fire and how different plants change in their use as they grow through time. So for instance, on this slide, you see bear grass, which is very bendable and good for basketry in a couple years following the fire. But as it grows, it gets stiff and the molecular structure changes, and it's no longer a high quality resource and needs to be burned again. So as I move towards wrapping things up today, I want to go through a couple examples of how we tied all of these components together for different cultural fire regime groups on specific example sites. And the first I want to highlight is our characteristics of our tan oak group. These stands tend to occur on lower elevation areas that have kind of a moderately high amount of spring sun. And this site in particular that I'm going to show you was mapped as being primarily Douglas fir in blue on this map in the center in a vegetation survey that occurred in the 1920s. And it has a historic trail going through it, which you can see. Today, this stand has remnant, very large old tan oak trees that have heavily branched and wide crowns. That suggests that they matured when the stand was a much lower density and they had a lot more sunlight and less competition for their crowns. We also have some very, very large Douglas fir stumps that were logged out, but you can see were still an important component of the stand. And everything around these remnants is really dense Douglas fir. And if we rewind the stand 150 years, you can picture that it was likely kind of really well spaced out tan oak and Douglas fir, that the spacing was wide enough that they could grow these really big branching crowns. And this suggests these stands likely burned every kind of 3 to 7 years in the fall, and that they occurred in the lower elevation, kind of pretty sunny but not super sunny areas. The next example is our black oak woodland group. And this group tends to occur in the lower elevation areas that are sunnier than the tan oak group. When we look at a GLO survey map from the 1880s, we see the surveyors noting that the prominent noteworthy trees were oak and pine. And again, it was along a trail. Today, this site is also predominantly dense Douglas fir and tan oak, but we have remnant black oak and pine. In areas where these trees are more abundant, the leaf litter is much drier and fluffier than the surrounding tan oak litter. There's also many very, very large dead manzanitas. And this is a clear indicator that the site used to be much more open and predominantly have a very low severity fire regime, because manzanitas not very tolerant of high severity fire, but it does need a fair amount of open sunlight to thrive. So we had to have both an open canopy, which was likely kind of kept by fire. And our work suggests that these stands burn more frequently, kind of every 3 to 5 years in the spring as well as in the fall. So as we look towards continuing this work, we still have to hone some of the estimates, and then are going to move into simulation modeling to calculate ignition probabilities and compare those probabilities to lightning and contemporary ignitions. And then finally, we're going to use state and transition modeling to better understand vegetation and cultural resource conditions that might have resulted from these fire regimes. So as we, and so in conclusion, I hope that this presentation of our process to develop these estimates might help facilitate similar collaborative work on other landscapes. While the specific dynamics and drivers might vary between these systems and cultures, we think that the process of collaboratively working to develop these estimates from a wide array of sources, and then grounding that work in thinking through the connections between cultural ecological dynamics of location, seasonality, and frequency are key elements that could be used in different places. And these maps and models won't be perfect, but they're a good tool to kind of begin conversations about collaborative restoration planning and adaptive management. So I will leave it at that, and I want to thank everyone here and acknowledge that this is an ongoing project and specifics may kind of still morph over time. But I don't know, I can take questions, or we can just integrate questions into the kind of upcoming panel.
Thanks, Skye. That was fantastic to learn about the work that you're doing up there on the Klamath and with the tribes up there. I don't see any specific questions in the chat at the moment, but this panel is definitely intended to be more interactive, and so I think that if folks do have questions or comments, we can definitely roll them into the larger discussion. And I'm gonna turn it over to Mary now to kind of kick off what her intent was, and if there are questions that come in, we'll come back to you, Skye, if that makes sense.
That sounds good.
Okay, thanks so much too. That was really great. Like I said, I really enjoyed learning about that work.
Thanks, it's been fun to work on.
Thanks, Skye, and thanks, Don. My name is Mary Huffman, and as a group of us tried to figure out what this special session would be made of, I started to think that as a non-Indigenous person who's really supporting Indigenous peoples' revitalization of their fire cultures, that it might make sense for some of us well-intended outsiders just to share experiences about what it's like to try to become a support person and a supportive partner. And it's not an easy journey. And so I had the opportunity to call upon some colleagues, including Skye and her adventures in research, as well as my dear friend Will Harling, who can put himself on the screen here, if you don't mind, Will. Will's one of the people that I know who is the longest standing person to attempt to support fire practices in an Indigenous environment in a practical sense. And a little bit later, we'll be joined by Sahoy Thrower. And one of the reasons that I wanted Sahoy to contribute is that she is a tribal member. She's a person of the Porch Band of Creek Indians. And she, if we can catch her, will share a little bit about how it's not easy to revitalize fire in all tribes. And in a contemporary context, there are some challenges that are within the tribes that make it difficult and also change the character of the support that they need from well-intended outsiders. I would also like to acknowledge our interpreters who are making it possible for Central and South American participants to participate, as well as some European folks. And so I don't want to dismiss your wisdom and your experience. And so we'll try to monitor the chat and try to answer some of those questions that are coming from those participants as best we can. So let me just start by saying that my involvement in this really started in the mid 2000s when I was listening to a bunch of Mayan farmers talk about how they used fire, and I was so just shocked and amazed, and just and you know, I'm telling stories on myself so that you'll understand that there's a lot of growth involved here. That I don't know why I didn't have any concept of what other people knew about fire. I had come into fire for prescribed burning for biodiversity reasons, and suddenly Steve Pine and I were talking about this work in Mexico, and he said, Mary, people all over the world have figured out these things about fire. And so I began reading, and that paper that Frank mentioned was the product, but that was the start of my journey. So I'm fairly new in this. It's my honor currently to be the staff person that supports the Indigenous Peoples Burning Network. And that's really designed to support Native American communities that are revitalizing, again, their fire traditions in a contemporary context. So I'm just the scaffolding builder and holder, and it's a great honor. So with that, let me turn it over to Will. This is designed to be very informal and a little bit more speaking from the heart than the numbers and statistics that we see in a lot of our talks. But Will, what's it been like for you? And before that, Will, hold on one second. I can't figure out why I'm still getting Skye as the speaker here. Maybe Sam can help with that.
Yeah, we see Mary and Skye and Will. So Will's ready.
Perfect.
Whenever. Yeah.
And let me also just invite any of the other folks that are on the call that have a depth in this work to make your video available when you want to contribute something. Will, how you doing?
Doing good, Mary. Thanks for inviting me to be here. I should introduce myself. My name is Will Harling. I'm the director of the Mid-Klamath Watershed Council. I'm also a co-lead of the Western Klamath Restoration Partnership, which formed in 2013 here in the Klamath Mountains. It's a 1.2 million acre landscape and that's surrounded by wilderness areas in far northwestern California. It's where I was born and raised. I'm a settler here on Kuduk lands and Kunamihu lands. My dad came here hunting for Bigfoot in the Summer of Love in 1969. And my mom came to the local hippie commune in 1970. And they met up in an old miner's cabin on McNeil Creek, right outside of Forks of Salmon in the heyday of the logging boom. My pops, who recently passed, like to say, I came to the Salmon River hunting for Bigfoot, and I found her. And my mom would elbow him and be like, Les, damn you. He's like, well, your feet are like size 10, Barbara, yeah, but anyways, I had the luck to be raised with Native families around me, and the reality at that time was those Native folks were still living underground. It wasn't cool to be Native. And they were preserving their cultures despite the very real pressures from white society to hold them back and to disenfranchise Native communities. One of my best friends growing up, and still to this day, is Holly Hensher, who's of Kanamihu and Karuk descent. She works in the social services system now in Humboldt County, dealing with court cases and being an advocate for Native folks who are into the court systems. But growing up around Native folks, I was really subject to a lot of the same pitfalls that non-Native folks fall into. We experience a different world, even though we live in the same place. I'll never forget when I had to move out of the Salmon River, which is along the Klamath River in far northwestern California, and go away to high school because there was no high schools locally. And I moved east to the Scott Valley and went to Etna High, and where the football coach was the history professor, and he taught us the history of dead white presidents, and taught us about manifest destiny, and taught us about why God was great, and so all that stuff, being white male, internalizing all that, it's affected who I am as a person and how I move through the world, and has really, I feel like my 47 years has been spent unlearning so many of the things that I was taught. And I have to thank that my Native colleagues for being patient with me as I've gone through that learning experience. The reality is, not just a handful of days ago, I said something on a conference call with Don that was, totally insensitive, criticizing a group that he was part of and making things happen in. And just unknowingly, rewind 3 months, and when Skye came down to the Klamath country with a group of visiting scientists to work on this state and transition reburn model stuff, Kathy McCovey shows up in the Cutter DNR parking lot 15 minutes late. And I'm like, Kathy, you got to go out there and meet these guys and tell them your vision of landscape scale fire. And Kathy's like, no, I'm gonna tell them about my dress that I made with my uncle. And I'm like, Kathy, it's not about your damn dress. It's about landscape scale fire, and all of a sudden, Kathy, she starts to get emotional, and there's a tear coming out of her eye, and she's like, it is about my damn dress. Every piece of that dress came from this land. Every piece of that dress came from me going out with my uncle and with my relatives and gathering, and that knowledge that turned that into that dress is the story of fire on this landscape. And 10 minutes later, we're both crying, and I'm like, you're right, Kathy, it is about that damn dress. And now get out there to the overlook on Perch Creek and tell them about your dress, because that's how we're going to make change. And so I just want to share, I've worked with tribal communities my whole life. I've tried to unlearn all that I was taught from dominant culture, and I've tried to center and elevate Native voices, and I still make mistakes pretty much daily. And so I think a huge piece of working with Native communities is being willing to make mistakes, being willing to be wrong, and having the fortitude to really look at ourselves and to look at how we can support Native communities. You know, the reality is that the landscape that I love is getting completely erased by high severity fire. So many of our sacred places have been lost to, you know, conflagrations that are a product of the cessation of indigenous burning, of industrial logging, of a century of fire exclusion. And, you know, the reality is that the only thing that's going to save those sacred places is us realizing we need to elevate traditional burning practices. We need to put Native people who understand fire on this landscape in positions of power and give them the resources to change our fire future in this place. You know, the reality is we have one of the most diverse ecosystem for conifer trees in the world. And what we're seeing is high severity fire at 9,000 feet in the bristlecone pine stands below Thompson Peak. You know, 10 years ago, we lost the largest brewer spruce. 3 years ago, we had high severity fire burn around the largest 8.5-foot DBH Port Orford cedar up on Clear Creek. We're losing our trees. We're losing our salmon. You know, all these watersheds that used to produce cold, clear water have either grown up in brush fields and those summer base flows have been cut in half, or they're moonscaped, like we saw with Indian Creek watershed in the Slater fire last year. And, you know, just 95% of the watershed burned at high severity. So, you know, we have a lot of work to do to get back to good fire in this place. And I think the key is that us non-Native folks realize that our fates are entwined with Native people, and that our survival in this place is tied to restoring those indigenous management practices that are the only proven way of managing fire on our landscape. You know, we spent a long time going in the wrong direction. This landscape, you know, had fire every 1 to 7 years or 1 to 15 years in some places. And as early as, you know, 5 or 6 years ago, over half of that landscape, 1.2 million acres, had not seen any fire in the past 100 years. And so places that would have, you know, 10 to 30 fire overlaps, or some places like Ecology, Stewardship, Off-Field Mountain, where there was ceremonial fires lit at the landscape scale every year. Those places have gone so long with fire. You know, it's like Carl Skinner, a local fire geographer, has said, you know, there's no time since the last ice age that we've had so little fire on this landscape. And so we're so highly departed from the historic condition. It's going to take us, you know, making huge societal shifts and trying something new. And the reality is that something new is something old. It's how Native people have managed fire on this landscape. And so us understanding how to work with Native communities, and being humble enough to not center ourselves and to work to elevate those tribal voices. You know, for me, it's like I work so hard, you know, and I want to be the one to tell the story. But the reality is I'm not the one to tell the story. You know, I need to be investing in Michael Sanchez, who's the new fuels battalion for the Karuk tribe, to help him tell his story. You know, because the reality is this isn't my story to tell. You know, this is something I was taught, and we, the non-Native community, has a huge role to play, because Native people shouldn't be spending their time having to educate a bunch of white folks about what's right. You know, that's our job. So we do have a role. It's very important. And the reality is that, you know, all of the outcomes we're looking for, you know, preserving diversity, protecting our communities, sequestering carbon, all these things are going to benefit us. They're going to come from that restored fire on the landscape that comes from centering Native peoples and traditional knowledge keepers like Bill Tripp, Frank Lake, Kathy McCovey, Margot Robbins, Elizabeth Azouz, Don Hankins, Ron Good, you know, all these folks that carry on that fire knowledge into the present day. So I'll stop there. I've been rambling.
Thank you so much, Will. And let me thank you specifically for a couple of things that I hope will continue through the session here. One is thank you for speaking from the heart. You've dedicated your life, your heart, as well as your mind and soul to this work, and you have so much to share with those of us that are just coming into this journey. Would also like to thank you for really making it clear that it's not about us. Those of us that are non-Indigenous would-be partners have a responsibility to open up this hegemonic system that we've developed around fire so that Indigenous peoples can step in and offer their corrections, offer their practices. And finally, I want to thank you for making it clear that and as Frank certainly did in his talk, that this is not just about physical processes for Indigenous peoples. It's way deeper than that. And those of us that have invested our lives in knowing the world in a rational way, and those of us that are scientists that know the world in a numbers way, it's not the only way of knowing. And so we have to be willing in cases like Mrs. McCovey to say, yeah, however you want to walk this path, let's go talk about, let us go listen about the dress. So thank you so much. And I know there's a bunch of questions already. If with your permission, Will, I'm gonna ask Monique if she wants to share her comment or if she wants me to read it. It's about humility and willingness to learn and build trust. Monique, do you want to add anything here? If so, just put your video on.
Oh, I know I've been in the background this whole conference, so can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yeah, share with us what you were thinking.
Mary was saying was really hitting home with me because I am Native and I work with Native communities, and even when you're Native, you still have to have that humility and walk in with an open heart. And I really appreciated you speaking from the heart because, I sometimes think our Native communities, we push away our allies sometimes because of the trauma that we've all gone through. And even got me emotional watching you. But just want to say thank you. And also, I've been shot down with project proposals, working with my children's tribe. Before I had children that were Spokane tribal members, I went and proposed a project, and they were like, why would we want an outsider doing this project with our cultural plants? And I just let it roll off and was like, okay. And so ended up having a successful project with the Confederated Colville tribes. And later, the Spokane tribe Fuels program approached me and asked if we could do a similar project with them. And so it took time, and perseverance and humility. And, as a Native woman, it means a lot to me, but sometimes you got to take the hits and just keep going and know that you're doing it with an open heart and, with humility. So.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for that. I think we have a question from Rodrigo, and I wanted to make sure that our colleagues that are maybe not native English speakers can offer. Rodrigo, with your permission, I'm going to read your question, and then any of us on the call can help answer. It says, I have the impression that Indigenous management is more complex than the classifications between early, modal, and late. There are several times and goals. Does this make the fire regime more uncertain and opportunistic than fixed regimes? And that's a really complicated question, but I'm going to invite Skye to take a crack at it first. What are you thinking, Skye?
That's good. I've been looking at that question and working on writing up a response, but I think you're absolutely correct. They're way more complicated than early, mid, and late in terms of just their seasonality. And I think one of the things that's really important in this is to really be open to listening to what that variability is and what that uncertainty is, and think about how that might change through different circumstances and time, because yeah, nothing is static. Things are changing with those circumstances. Kind of jumping to the modeling side of things that we've been thinking about. One of the ways that I didn't really get into, but we're going to work on that, is by actually eventually working to model ignition probability in a framework that really incorporates uncertainty. So rather than thinking about those kind of mean estimates, we'll be going through lots of modeling iterations that draw from those whole ranges, so that you can ultimately kind of model the fact that these things are going to vary through time. And what you don't get there is that in Indigenous fire stewardship, those interactions are really intentional, and the model is just going to be drawing them somewhat randomly. And so it gets us one step closer to being able to think about those cultural ignitions and comparing them to lightning ignitions, but a computer and a person on the ground are just inherently really different. And there's no way that we can recreate that. And so I think similarly, just kind of acknowledging that humility, that this is our best estimate. It's going to help us develop this communication tool to move adaptive management and collaboration forward. And ultimately, it's going to be wrong a lot of the time. And we just hope that it's right more often than it's wrong, or that it's more right or more useful than it is wrong. And kind of all models are that way, but especially when you're trying to do something like this and take this like really important complex factor that's biophysical and cultural and spiritual and related to, conditions that might change throughout a day or throughout an hour, and make a computer model of it is almost a goofy, pompous thing to try to do. But that we can start to demonstrate some of those connections.
Yeah, thank you. And Skye, I'm going to just add a question that's in the chat that came up when you were giving your talk. I think it's relevant to your experience. I don't have a name of the questioner, but it says, how do you prevent appropriation by an agency that basically says, thanks for the maps and the knowledge, we'll do it. We'll take over now.
Yeah, that's a really good and really important question. It's a real concern. So part of this work, it came from the Western Klamath Restoration Partnership and the Karuk tribe saying, hey, we'd like to do this work. So the whole impetus behind it is because folks on the ground, like the tribe and also the collaborators, Will and other folks said, hey, this is important information that we'd like. So the fact that this information was going to be developed was something that was kind of already collaboratively decided upon. And then as a non-native researcher, I've gone through a whole practicing peak job research agreement with the Karuk tribe that essentially says, before I present any of this information, like this presentation today, write a report, publish a study, the tribe has full review over it. And we've worked really hard throughout this to think about what pieces of information are okay to share, what spatial scales are we okay sharing, what spaces on the landscape are kind of being used as demonstrations and often being talked about in the public, and which ones are not, and we don't want to show those in our presentations. And so hopefully it's an easy review process, but then it definitely comes back saying, oh, let's not say that, let's do this, so that information that's being shared has been kind of okayed and collaboratively decided, like, this is what we think will be useful and hopefully won't be appropriated. And since it's being developed in that collaborative framework, it's a tool that people want to move forward. And the hope is that it can then be used to move things forward. But that's a risk, and it's not a risk that I'm making any of the decisions on. It's a risk that I'm working with a large group of people to decide, are we comfortable with this? Do we think those benefits outweigh the possible consequences?
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to just mention that I think it was Amy Cardinal Christensen that asked that question. Amy, you're co-organizer in this whole session. Do you want to pop in with your video or ask a related question?
Sorry, I'm trying there. I had a delay on my thing. No, I think that was a good answer from Skye. I just always have that concern. I know there's a lot of concerns in Canada about sharing that, the knowledge, especially in Canada, we have crown lands. And then the agencies will just say, well, we have the expertise. So, thanks for showing us your intervals and how you burn and where you burn. And we'll just go and do that for you now because, you haven't done it in a long time and we're the experts. So for me, it's always like a super concern with doing this type of work. But at the same time, trying to build those outside relationships too is, important as well. So.
Yeah, and one of the biggest sources of funding in the United States anyway for any kind of fire research is public money. And as soon as you publish something or as soon as you try to write your report up about what you did, you're making that information public. So I think that process of early on figuring out what's to be shared, what's not to be shared, and how you're going to protect that is super important. I'm going to take a chance here and tell a story about my experience. I think it will help those of us that are really early on in this process. Look at that cutie. There's a burner right there. She's hiding under a blanket, but that's okay. So I started in this work, as I mentioned, and I started really as an outgrowth of the Western Klamath Restoration Partnership. And it became obvious really early on that cultural burning was the niche that this particular network and collaboration would focus on that was different from some of the other fire networks that were in play and had been for 15, 20 years. And so I was just starting to visit and was sitting down at the picnic table with some of the people that had decided to found the network. And I wanted to acknowledge Don Hankins and Frank Lake, who are here as a couple of the co-founders. And I was just trying to figure out how to get comfortable. And so I was just making some informal conversation. And I said to this person, Margot Robbins, who's a cultural burner and cultural leader in the Yurok tribe, how she's doing, what was going on these days. And she said, well, we're preparing for our summer dances, and that is pretty consuming. And I said, well, will you be dancing? And she said, oh, Mary, I have 5 children. Oh my God. I was like, I'm on the wrong planet. I clearly don't know what I'm saying. I don't even know what I'm asking. Now what? And lucky for me, I didn't say anything more. And she was very kind and didn't pursue it and tell me what an idiot I was. But the reality is, like Will said, you are going to make mistakes. And I think as long as you're not arrogant and you're not assuming and whatnot, that you'll be forgiven. So there are a couple of philosophies for those of us beginners. One is do some homework. You should know the basic history of how non-Indigenous people have impacted tribes and First Nations. You should know when the treaties were made. You should know how treaties have not been honored. You should know some of those basics. And then you should just be aware that you're probably never going to quite get it right. And that may work for you or it may work against you. I'll share a corollary story of a conversation with the same person, and then I'm going to open it up for others who want to share stories. So another time, Margot and I were talking, and I said, it's a really interesting thing. We have this deer herd in our neighborhood. These are mule deer, and one of them is white. It's not albino. It's got kind of these gray patches on it. And since then, deer people have told me that's a piebald deer. And she said, wow, you must be someone special. And I thought, well, I'm not anyone special. The color of the deer has nothing to do with me. I mean, I'm just, seeing this from my perspective. And then later I thought, you know what? I have no idea why that white deer is there. I have no idea all of the dimensions of the way plants and animals appear, don't appear. And that in reality, I'm never going to know. And that it's okay. And those of us that come from a Eurocentric background, we think we're supposed to control nature. That's the basic foundation of our rational thinking, is that if we can control nature, figure out how it works, have influence over it, that things will be better. And of course, what we're finding in this era is that that really has some extraordinary unintended consequences. So the other philosophy about being a beginner is just get started. You're going to make mistakes anyway. And if you're well-intended and honest and transparent, that my colleague, a Blackfeet man named Dylan DeRosier would say, don't worry, Mary, you can't start to make mistakes fast enough. Just get into the work. So with that, let me open it up, and I see that Frank is here and Don is here. So if any of you want to open up your video, or anyone else to offer a story, let it rip.
I was just going to comment, Mary, on the question about the kind of the regimes, and it's becoming much more apparent as I've been able to bring fire back into some of the same places more and more frequently, and that is that one, reading the landscape is really a central part of Indigenous fire. Knowing how and when to put fire into a place is really part of knowing what that landscape is telling you. And I think your story talking about the white deer as an example is really important around like looking for those indicators and the validation within the landscape that tells you something is right or is going to reward you from that burn. The point that I was going to make is that in some of the places where I've run fire, and I'm dealing in a lot of cases of putting fire into places that have a lot of invasive species, and we're using fire to restore landscapes back to native species dominance, that once we get native species dominance back into some of these places, the regime shifts entirely. And each year is going to present something different based on the amount of rainfall, based on the assemblages of species that shift in those places. Of fire spatially changes each time, and the timing of those fires changes each time. So I might be able to run fire consecutively, back to back, year after year sometimes, and sometimes I have to wait to put fire back in that place based on which species are there. But those species are going to tell me when and how that fire needs to be there. And so I think that's a really important point to kind of bring up. And I know, and I'll speak, kind of while I'm speaking as an Indigenous practitioner here in California, when I travel to Australia, I'm an outsider in that country, but still seen as an Indigenous practitioner still. But there's still those kind of common things that I really pick up on and see that that it really is about reading the landscape. And so I think, for people to start to pay more attention to what the landscape is showing is really one of the ways that we can start to understand it more. And so I just wanted to share that story.
Yeah, thank you so much. And Kira, I see you put your video on. I understand you're not an Indigenous person and you're working in this environment. So yeah, what's on your mind?
Oh, I was just going to mention that most of the learnings I've had about Indigenous fire don't actually take place on the land. They usually take place in kitchens, drinking tea, and with many, many children around. I've often gone to communities, after I've been invited, and I've just kind of not known what to do. And I've sat in an Airbnb for a few weeks, just kind of thinking, well, I don't really know how to go about this, until you just kind of get invited for a cup of tea. And then sometimes relationships form, and you just have this Western idea about how you should be doing science or how you should be going about a relationship building. But sometimes it's not like that at all. And also sometimes in Canada, it's pretty complex, because sometimes I'll have invitations to come into communities from hereditary chiefs, but not from band councils. And, there's divisions that I'm not really aware of, and it can make doing research a little bit more complicated. I've been out on a few burns now, and, been told by wildfire agencies, like, you shouldn't have gone to that. Like, that was not sanctioned, but hereditary chiefs are there. They're saying, well, yeah, no, it's sanctioned by us. And so it's a complex kind of area to navigate, and I'm still learning. I think that putting down roots in a place where you can kind of think about being in a place for a long time and making relationships that they can count on you to be there, and sometimes just listen and not ask anything, I've found has been really helpful. As well as bringing my kids out. My kids are everywhere. I can't stop them from coming to conferences with me, apparently. But also, I think that I never go any places in any communities without children being part of things. And so I think that, having my kids with me just makes me seem more of a human being sometimes, or just someone who's open to different relationship styles, I guess, that are sometimes not accepted in other realms or it's not considered professional. But I find I'm very at home in communities. I'm always feeling very welcome.
Yeah, thank you. This work takes some courage. And as Monique said, humility is super important. And trust is something that is hard to earn and easy to lose. But nonetheless, if the Black Lives Matter movement taught us anything, it's that people who have realized privilege from the dominant culture have a responsibility to change that culture and to open up those opportunities for other people to step in and make a difference. And I think each of us on this call has a responsibility to, help to open those cracks and ply open those environments, whether it's in policy or practice and other things, so that Indigenous people can lead. It's not going to be easy, and we got to get used to getting whacked a little bit. And I'm going to hazard an opportunity. I don't know if you will bite, but Amy, the other day when we were on a planning call, you were saying, oh yeah, I've heard that. And I've heard that. And oh my, I just hate it when people say this or that. And so I know that those of us that are Indigenous on this call, not me, could offer a few don'ts to those of us that really would like to know how not to put our foot in our mouths. And so if anybody wants to offer something in the chat or by video to say, just please don't say that when you come to work with my community.
I'll add in there. I guess the one for me is after, even as a Western scientist working with other academics and talking about a spiritual perspective and not trying to represent the tribe, but the one that I was taught or my family, and have them be, you really believe that? And just kind of being like, it's tough because you talk about like, but I see some from the perspective of that, oh, well, it's spirituality that guides why you're using fire, and they're genuinely trying to understand. But then there's also this kind of almost disbelief, like you believe that there's medicine people that can affect weather to strike lightning in a place that will ignite a fire where you want, or that you can control weather and a little bird has that power. You believe that? And it's really disrespectful. It's just, a way of being like, oh, I had never considered that. That's a really insightful perspective of how you understand a relationship between natural processes and the elements and fire effects on your landscape through your traditional beliefs. And so, I even myself, kind of think about, oh, I'm a Western scientist, I think about this, or I question a spiritual belief. It's tough and it's challenging, but at the same time, be open and that you can respect what you don't understand.
Yeah, I think for me, Mary, the one I always hear, and maybe I'm kind of more of an agency setting, but I always hear like either those or that knowledge is myths. People sometimes use that term, or they'll say, that's all great, but it's not applicable to today. So, it was fine that you guys did that 100 years ago, but you can't do it now. There's too many values on the landscape. Everything's changed. You've lost all your knowledge. And I mean, that's just downright false. So I don't even have to go into more detail on it. So yeah, don't say that because it's not true.
Yeah, I think those are really great points, and I would just add on some of that too is also the assumption that all Indigenous people have the knowledge of fire, and I'm getting that a lot more now because particularly because of the media interest around fire, that there's certain voices that people hear about a lot because either they are people who know, and in our local areas of California there aren't huge numbers of practitioners who really carry that knowledge, and so it is appropriate for those people to be talking about it. But and they're trying to make space and mentor people to come up, but there's an assumption of, well, we've heard too many times from this person, so is there somebody else in a different community that we can talk to? Sometimes there isn't, and so you can't just assume that all Native people have that knowledge. And we all have different areas of knowledge that we carry. Just think about that in society, and so the same thing is true in our own communities too. And I think just resonating off of what Amy said, and this is something that I hear all the time is, well, that's fantastic about Indigenous fire, but like we've got assets at risk and we've got these different things, and how can you do that? And oh, your tribal burn, your cultural burning should only be on tribal lands. And as I said in the earlier session, the tribal lands, like we never gave up our rights to the land. Sometimes you get the comment, oh, you lost the war. We lost the war with a disease that came in from explorers, and like we're all undergoing this pandemic right now. Like this is not news to us how to survive a pandemic, but it's like we didn't lose a war. We lost the numbers of people to maintain our culture, and that we're trying to keep it going as best we can. And that sometimes is really difficult to hear people say things like that, or we can't work with them because they're not qualified. And my thought about that qualification is that you're not qualified because you don't have our knowledge system. But I never say that, but it is something that floats through my mind. I mean, I've driven home from meetings, 2 hours driving home, stewing over the comments that I hear, and it's sickening sometimes, but it's important to start to make the space for it. And I appreciate Will saying, we shouldn't put it on Indigenous people to, explain why it's important. Like, yeah, we need allies that can go out and speak on our behalf for these issues and why it's important and why everybody should care about it. So I really appreciate that.
Thank you, Don. And we had a comment from Monique, and Monique, I'm perfectly happy for you to share your words.
I was agreeing with everything everyone was saying. My big thing, I hear it all the time when people start talking about, they'll be like, when tribes burned, and I try to really focus on making sure that I say like, tribal people practice cultural burning, and since they've been removed, in the past 100 years, like I try to tell that story, and it's really difficult because I know that whenever we talk about, federal agencies talk about fire in the past, it's hurting Native people because it's perpetuating the idea that we're not here influencing the landscape and that we're not living cultures that have adapted over time and are still adapting.
Yeah, thank you. This is deep and hard stuff. And so if you intend to be a supportive partner
that we have now, they probably would have done. So that's one of the big things.
Yeah,
always good to.
That's rough stuff. Thank you. Sohoy Thrower has joined us. Welcome, Sohoy. I'm so glad to see you. One of the reasons why I asked Sohoy if she'd be willing to participate in this panel is that from my listening, Sohoy is a person who has a connection with fire and is part of a community that has moved away from fire. And that it's important for those of us who are trying to be supportive to hear where the community is and where the cultural leaders and other members of the community are in their fire journey. And we may have ideas of what we think would be helpful, but sometimes we don't even understand the context. So Sohoy, whatever you would like to share about what's happening with the Porch Band, and how you're thinking about fire. We'd love to hear it.
Yeah, I apologize I couldn't join until now, but just from the little I've heard, I really resonated with it, what everyone is saying. I think they can all relate to this to some degree. But yeah, like you said, we've completely lost our traditional, culturally grounded fire burning practices. We certainly have a historical precedent for it. It's a huge part of our culture historically, but you know, something I often really drill home with people is that when you talk about assimilation and loss of culture, I mean, a lot of the things that weren't considered essential to culture were kind of the first things lost. And when you lose a lot of your land and you're pinned off into a certain area, you know, you can understand where the prescribed burning techniques would have been some of the, maybe the first things gone. And, you know, we even, you know, language as essential and basic as that is to culture, we lost our language, our fluent speakers in the 60s and 70s. So, you know, it didn't die, but we're waking it back up, right, with other fluent speakers from other affiliated tribal groups that share our language. So, you know, when you're trying to rebuild dances, songs, language, and medicine, things like that, you know, it's, some things are intact because they were so essential, you know, because doctors were very harsh in the area towards the Native community here. The Creek people were Creek, Muskogee Creek. And so those kinds of things were kept intact, you know, folk medicine techniques, things to keep people alive when they're sick, ways to feed people, wild harvesting. That's the kind of stuff that, you know, I can still know from my grandmother to a degree. But prescribed burning, sorry, my light went out. Prescribed burning is not something that I was raised with at all in my family. And so, but I feel it very strongly in my heart to pursue it. I feel like it's a huge part of our relationship to our Indigenous territory. That's just evident scientifically. So it's been a really difficult process to try to kind of bring unity for that in my tribe, to promote interest in that, but also to get the knowledge I need. And so I've spent a lot of time with people in more of a Western context, learning from them professionals, and then trying to re-indigenize that knowledge specific to where I live. But yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think this might not be my place to bring up, so you just cut me off if it's not going to work for you. But in some places, the advance of gaming and the casinos has placed a different lens upon risk and the risk that business operators see around fire. Do you want to comment at all on that, or does anybody else?
I'll let anyone else take the floor first if they have any thoughts on that.
I can just comment a little bit from some of the tribes that I work with here in California, that we've got some tribes that have really lucrative casino businesses and other business ventures that they have become through those processes and being very business oriented in the legal frameworks around that, worried about the liability issues. And so we've got tribes now that are trying to revitalize cultural fire and other fire practices, that their own councils and their business council allowing for them to do burning. And so it's like, not only do you have to prove yourself to the agencies, but now you also have to prove yourself to yourself, which is a really weird place to be. And we've got, you know, Mary, I know you can speak to this from some of the trips you've made out to California, that there are some of the tribes that have some pretty good landholdings. You know, they've repurchased ancestral territories, you know, portions of the ancestral territories and stuff like that. And those places need fire, but they're not going to be able to put fire on it for a while until they can get the liability aspect to a level of comfort. I'm hoping that some of the policies that we've worked on in the state will have helped to shift that. But that's a little insight from what I see happening.
Let me just offer a tool to those of us well-intended outsiders that may be supporting more than one tribe, or even supporting a particular tribal nation. And that is that they have the right to self-determination. And if it turns out that the Karuk tribe is not taking the same approach as the Porch Creek band of Creek people is taking, that's their right. And so it's super important to respect that. And as you navigate, and so as let's say Sahoy and I are having a conversation about how you doing, how you thinking about fire, what's your next step? Is there anything that you might need from, the Indigenous Peoples Burning Network? Her needs are going to be different. And it absolutely blows me away that we see the incredible policy and funding changes that are being made in California. Both of the efforts of tribal people leading and well-intended supporters that are as dedicated as Will. But there are other places where they're saying, I just need to find out who in my community is a keeper of fire knowledge. And so then we say, well, do you want to have a dinner? Do you want to have a field trip? Do you want to go walking with someone that and you need time off from work? Or, how does that look? And so all these journeys are going to be different, but I can tell you this as a well-intended outsider, the joy that you see when Native people reconnect with fire is unmatched. And the depth of that meaning is impossible for us, non-Indigenous people to understand, but it's there, it's real. And I can tell you once fire comes back, it is not going away.
I want to give a shout out to the value of tribes like the Karuk who have held on to their fire knowledge, perhaps more than others, just simply by the fact that some of their lands didn't have as much gold under the soil as areas to the east of here, where the genocide was more complete, because of the gold rush and what followed. But what we're seeing through the Klamath treks is other tribes who have lost a little bit more of their land knowledge or fire knowledge coming here and connecting with the Karuk as teachers to share those traditions, because like we were talking about earlier, Indigenous fire management is so different from the scientific way of looking at fire, in the sense that it's a way of life. It connects to everything, and when you live around Native people, especially the folks that I mentioned earlier that have that connection to fire that was unbroken, it's such a powerful way of seeing the world that unites who we are as humans. Leif Hillman, a local ceremonial leader, said in an interview, our religion is about survival in place. And survival in this place, food security, meant how they manage fire to create resources to have that harvestable surplus. So it's very important as we start to learn about fire in the West that Native people are leading that effort, and there's a place for other Native tribes who want to get that knowledge to come. And so in California right now, there's legislation to create prescribed fire training centers. And there's a push by the state and federal agencies to have that centered at McClellan Air Force Base, and for it to be led by state and federal agencies. Well, there's also a push by Native folks, Don and Bill Tripp and others are working on this, to have training centers that are Indigenous led in those places where that fire knowledge still exists, so that those those state and federal resources need to become available to allow those Indigenous fire knowledge keepers to be able to disseminate that knowledge right now when we need it most. So that's an opportunity for all of us on this call, help us to have the political clout and pressure to be able to get the state and feds to invest in tribally led cultural fire training centers or prescribed fire training centers, because really we need to touch more of those people that are going to be out there on the landscape, whether they're tribal or non-tribal who are going to be putting fire on the ground. So it's better fire that's getting put on the ground.
Super. We have about another 20 minutes, I think. And to me, that's just a generous gift and an opportunity for many of the people who have been just sitting in the background listening to contribute. I know there are a number of researchers in the audience who have been venturing into this work that might have something to share. I know there are other Indigenous people that are trying to figure out how to help non-Indigenous well-intended outsiders to actually be of help. So please put a note in the chat and we'll start picking those things up. If someone has something off the top of the head they want to add, just join right in. I have one question or a comment that came in a little bit earlier. This is a gentleman named Matt Rance. Matt, thank you for this comment. It says, the conversation is inspiring. I'm a non-Indigenous person working for a Canada government agency. We're in the early stages of partnering with First Nations to support Indigenous fire stewardship. I find myself walking the line between a desire to learn and support this practice and the very real issues around the history of broken promises and appropriation of knowledge. Matt, did you want to offer anything else about that and what this feels like to be in your journey?
Yeah, can you hear me?
I can.
We can.
Yeah, so I'm in southwestern Alberta. I'm the fire management officer for Waterton Lakes National Park, and we're working with some of the local Blackfoot nations who've approached us to work with them on putting fire back onto the ground. And this is all, I'm struggling for words here. I just have to say, like, this, it's so inspiring to hear people who are further down the road in this journey than I am. I have a lot of empathy for the people who've put the foot in their mouth and made mistakes, and I think I have some fear around kind of mucking it up. I just see such a tremendous opportunity, both from a like an ecological restoration and risk reduction standpoint, but also reconciliation and righting past wrongs. So I guess I'm just looking for guidance on how to be a good ally and how to support this process and see Indigenous people take leadership, lead this process, but also recognize that I think, as Will said earlier, this is the only proven way to do fire management. Like, this is, so I guess as someone who's responsible for a fire program, I absolutely want to learn from these people, but do it in a respectful way. And so one of the things that we're batting around and trying to find, navigate the bureaucracy is how to invite that leadership, like, say onto jurisdiction that I'm responsible for, and kind of have that two-way dialogue of, okay, like, here's what I can offer from like the Western science approach and kind of the big government bureaucracy with all sorts of resources, but also to like adapt my practices to what's happened historically. I don't know if this is making any sense. I'm kind of rambling a little bit, but I see like one of the issues I see is what, you know, Amy brings up, is that there's this long history in Canada, at least, of people going to Indigenous groups and essentially extracting knowledge, and then saying, okay, yeah, we're done, we got your knowledge, now we'll take it from here. And I don't want that. And I don't even though my intent is would never be for that to happen. There's a long history of that, and I'm sensitive even to perceptions of that.
Yeah, well, I certainly appreciate, you know, the genuineness with which you're approaching this. Let me just invite some of our Indigenous folks to offer a suggestion, and then I'll offer one at the end as again a well-intended outsider. What can Matt do?
Sorry, I was just trying to unmute there, Mary, but I was frozen. So I'm working to help Matt a little bit on this. And I think like he's doing a fantastic job of trying to support the nation in the work. But what's happening is we're kind of coming up against some other agencies and things too. But Matt, I was just talking to Alvin yesterday from the nation there, and he was saying how, you know, how good it's been working with you guys. So, you know, I think that you're just to, you know, build your confidence too, that I think that you guys are taking the right approach. Like you're, yeah, having lots of different talks and trying to, you know, support the community. I think that what Matt wants is for there to be Indigenous led burns in the park, which I think is exciting, and the community is excited about it too.
I just want to say it's so inspiring to hear your story, Matt, you know, as with how much pushback we get here from most of our fire management officers when it comes to engaging Indigenous practitioners in burns. It's so refreshing to hear your intention, you know, and I really feel like, you know, intention is the spark. And then, you know, being willing to stick it out when it gets hard, you know, when your agency is telling you one thing and your tribal partners are telling you something else, you know, how you balance those two incongruous objectives over time is really how you develop trust in the long term. And you know, just for example, you know, it took us 2 years locally, you know, supporting the Kuduk tribe to even get the Region 5 Forest Service to affirm the rights that they knew they already had through interagency agreements to boss burns on federal lands. And so it took, you know, letters to the regional forester, several conference calls,